far too often I'd find myself standing on the, railway station platform after a day in the office and really just questioning, what did I actually contribute today? Like I didn't feel fulfilled. And as Steve Jobs said, if you find yourself looking in the mirror day after day after day after day, and you tell yourself that I don't really want to do what I'm doing today, or something just doesn't feel right, it's incongruent, then you need to start seeking out alternatives.
Hello, folks. Welcome to the Millennial Mastermind, the personal development platform for entrepreneurial millennials looking for the tools, tactics, and inspiration to turn your business ownership dreams into a reality. Today, I am very excited to welcome Steve Glaveski to the Mastermind. Steve, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Brad.
Yeah, I'm excited to record this episode. We just had the opportunity to kind of switch roles. Did a quick episode or recording for your show, and I am so used to being on this side of the microphone that I welcomed you to your own show.
Well, I was tempted to welcome myself to the Millennial Mastermind podcast, but I thought I'd let you hold the reins.
Yeah, you should have done it. Revenge welcoming. So you are the CEO and co-founder of an innovation accelerator called Collective Campus. You founded a children's entrepreneurship program called Lemonade Stand. You are the author of an Amazon bestseller, The Innovation Manager's Handbook, and then you have a new book out, The Employee to Entrepreneur, How to Earn Your Freedom and Do Work That Matters. You also host your podcast, Future Squared. You do keynote speaking. You're an advisor to startups. Like it's just not like this list keeps going on. So it's a pretty intimidating list here, but also excites me because there's so much that we can talk about. And there's so much that we can dive into in this episode. But to kick it off, I would love to really go down that track, borrowing the title of your book of Employee to Entrepreneur. What did that journey look like from a 30,000 foot level to get into entrepreneurship?
Yeah, so from a 30,000 foot level, like many kids growing up, I was creative. I was playing in bands in my teen years. In fact, I had hair down to my waist. I played in heavy metal bands and in fact played in an 80s glam rock band. So I've still got a pair of zebra print pants somewhere in my closet at home. But nonetheless, as you're getting older, you seek to comply with society's conventions of what success looks like. And in my case, that meant getting a master's degree in accounting, putting on a suit with a Windsor knot, nice and tight, and eventually getting a gig with the likes of Ernst & Young and later KPMG and Macquarie Bank. And while I like to say that I had the trappings of success in terms of the six-figure salary, the business class flights around the world, and attending all sorts of fun corporate junkets, which were fun. I mean, I was in my late 20s at the time and had a lot of fun there. But what I found was after a while, all these extrinsic motivators didn't really align or weren't enough to reconcile the fact that the intrinsic stuff, the purpose, the autonomy, the mastery just wasn't there. And I like to say I found myself miserably comfortable while I was in that world. And what essentially happened was I observed that there was a hell of a lot of vacant office space in the corporate world. And I knew that there was a massive upswing in the number of freelancers and entrepreneurs and whatnot having a crack at doing their own thing. So I thought maybe I can reconcile this. And like every second person in the startup ecosystem nowadays, I thought I'd build a marketplace and an Airbnb for office space, as it was, called Hot Desk. And that's going back about 7-8 years now. And the long story short was that while I was working at Macquarie Bank in a full-time role, I spent little more than $2,000 building a prototype with nothing more than an Airbnb script and a web developer I found on freelancer.com. I then proceeded to Google how to write a press release and sent out this press release advertising my new product, Hot Desk, to about 100 journalists whose email addresses I'd found on Twitter, whereas nowadays you can use growth hacking tools like Hunter to do that for you. And of course, one got back to me. But it happened to be one of the biggest newspapers in Australia. They published an article a couple of weeks later, and on the back of that article, I started having conversations with a few early stage investors. And 3 months later, I'd raised about $150,000. And so that was my ticket to explore entrepreneurship, at least for a year. And like I said, it's been about 8 years and I haven't looked back.
Wow, that's a really cool way to get into the field and just start exploring that opportunity. But I think that your story in terms of your corporate path, at least up until your late 20s, is going to really ring a bell with a lot of the folks who are listening, because there's a lot of really ambitious and smart people who listen to this show who are doing well in their corporate careers, but also, like, that's not the end all be all for them. So what was really the catalyst for you to make that transition and start exploring the entrepreneurial world? You were making pretty good money. You were had those kind of the facade of success, and you had some of those that I wrote down, miserably comfortable. But was there one point that sparked that, or was it just after years of this, you were ready to make a change?
Well, it's funny. I think I find that in life, there's rarely just one point. It's usually a buildup of a number of things over time. And in my case, even before I started exploring Hot Desk, like I had founded a few quasi businesses. Like I ran a heavy metal nightclub called the Madhouse on Friday nights while I was working at Ernst & Young, which I think, like yourself with your side hustle, it's always advisable where if you're not really content in your job, like having that creative outlet on the side, whether it's a podcast, whether it's an online store, whatever it is. I think there's research in Harvard Business Review that suggests that actually makes you a lot more content and a lot more focused in your day job as well. So employers listening to this should really encourage that kind of thing, having a side hustle. That was one thing. Before that, before I'd read books like The Lean Startup and The 4-Hour Workweek, I spent countless hours putting together business plans for ideas like, say, a maxi tap, which was born out of my frustration of going to music festivals and lining up in a 50-meter long line to buy a beer or two, only to find that the people at the very front of that line were pouring one beer at a time. So maxi tap was essentially, well, what if we create this machine that can pour 8 beers at a time? And met with engineers and things of that persuasion, and creating a prototype in that space would have been prohibitive. But as we know these days, it's about testing market appetite. And to do that, you don't need to build a functional prototype. So I'd always dabbled in entrepreneurship. But what I found was far too often I'd find myself standing on the railway station platform after a day in the office and really just questioning, what did I actually contribute today? Like I didn't feel fulfilled. And as Steve Jobs said, if you find yourself looking in the mirror day after day after day after day, and you tell yourself that I don't really want to do what I'm doing today, or something just doesn't feel right, it's incongruent, then you need to start seeking out alternatives. And that's essentially how Hot Desk came about. And you know what? There was a fair bit of luck involved. When people talk about their successes, they make it out like, yeah, it was this perfect step-by-step strategy. But hey, I was lucky that one of those 100 journalists responded. They published the article. I was lucky that certain investors happened to read that article. So never play down the role that luck plays. But yeah, it wasn't one catalyzing moment. It was a number. But ultimately, finding myself unfulfilled day after day after day was the key thing.
Yeah, I agree with that with luck, but also I'd have to say how many people are doing the work, especially back in those days where you have to go to each individual reporter's Twitter page and pull out that email address and then sending out that press release. So it's a combination of putting in the hard work and then letting the luck find you because you put that out there. So I think there's definitely both components of it. When you were making that move into entrepreneurship, and especially when you decided to ultimately quit your job to go into it full time, what were your biggest fears at that point in time? And since then, have you had any experiences that help address those fears of the past?
Yeah, so I think the two biggest fears, up until that point, very much when I was deliberating between, say, potential job opportunities, the first thing I would always look at would be how much are they going to pay me, right? And when I essentially jumped out of the corporate world and started working on Hot Desk, I paid myself $500 a week. So that's basically $26,000 salary, which was a fraction of what I was getting previously. And it's easy to compare yourself to your former colleagues in that space who are on six figures. They've still got all the trappings of wealth and success, and society favors that. And so my first fear was, well, what if this doesn't work out and then I can't make it back into the corporate world? And then I essentially end up being penniless or whatever the case is. Now I'd spent almost 10 years in the corporate world up until that point. I had qualifications, I had a lot of experience. So I think that was a flawed belief. If you take 12 months out, even up to 24 months, and things don't work out, it's quite likely that you'll be able to transition back into the corporate world, into a reasonably well-paying role. So I would definitely not let that hold you back. The second thing would just be around letting family down. In my case, my family moved to Australia in the 70s from the then socialist, communist Yugoslavia, and they didn't speak a word of English. They had very little money to their name, very little education. So they toiled away in factories for decades, trying to make life better for their children, for me and my sister. So given that I was given the opportunity, that foundation had been laid, I put in the hard yards in university to get into reputable organizations to make good money. And then suddenly I'm saying, well, I don't want this. I want to jump out and pay myself $500 a week and give this incredibly risky entrepreneurship thing a shot. But it was, like I said, give it 12 months. If it doesn't work out, you can go back into the corporate world. You can work some more. And then again, if you experience that itch, jump out again. And it was funny though, because family was actually quite supportive. Like, they didn't get it 100%. They were like, well, you work so hard to get into these big firms like EY and Macquarie Bank and whatnot, but they were supportive nonetheless. And so if you are making that move, and whether it's your parents, whether it's your spouse, whoever it is, having that conversation early on so that they can feel like they were a part of that journey and they understand it, rather than questioning and pushing back, because the last thing you want is the people closest to you to not understand it and to question you, because that's going to make you question what you're doing as well.
Yeah, because we hear so frequently, it's not about what other people think, but when it is those people who are the closest in your life, and you talk about that, and I think specifically about my wife, if I didn't have her support along the way, it would make things much more difficult. And having that support system, or having it somebody actively working against me who is that close to me and that much of an influence in my life, would definitely be a challenge.
Yeah, it can be quite emotionally debilitating. And once your emotions are clouded, you don't make good decisions. It's hard to play the long game. And when you're trying to build something that is essentially fraught with uncertainty and ambiguity, which is the nature of entrepreneurship, you really need that. You need to be emotionally grounded. So having the support of those people closest to you goes a long way.
So what ultimately came of Hot Desk, that first venture that you had explored?
To put it bluntly, not a lot. I built the supply side of the marketplace to about 1,200 locations across Asia Pac. But as any marketplace entrepreneur will tell you, building the supply side is easy pickings. Building the demand side is another story altogether. And while we had revenue coming in, for me, it wasn't enough. Secondly, what I found was that a lot of people would be using the platform to, say, book a space, maybe for an hour, maybe for a day. And then if they liked it, they would negotiate directly with the actual operator of that space. So it's not like an Airbnb where I might stay in, say, Laguna Beach over in California for a few days, but I'm very unlikely to call the landlord and say, hey, I love this place. I think I want to take out a 2-year lease. That just does not happen. So you haven't got that frequency of use. So that was one of the shortcomings of the platform. And then the third thing really was, I worked on Hot Desk for 2 years. And what I came to the conclusion that entrepreneurship is definitely what I want to do. I love the autonomy. I love the learning. I love the growth. I love the challenge. But in order to play the long game, I need to truly align with the underlying purpose. And with Hot Desk, I felt like I was more or less a glorified real estate agent. And it wasn't something that got me out of bed with a spring in my step every morning. And I think in order to play that long game, you really need to seek out that purpose and believe in what you're doing. It's just going to give you it's going to give you a higher likelihood of success. So Hot Desk basically came to naught, but financially it came to naught. However, in terms of the learnings that I gathered during that process, that was worth gold, because I then used those learnings to work on my subsequent venture.
And so what did that look like? So you mentioned earlier, you went into that with the mindset of, okay, you've got 12 months at least, and then I can always come back and look at it and taking another corporate role. You did 2 years with Hot Desk, and then you learned a lot of skills, definitely some valuable gold-worthy lessons learned along the way. But where do you go from there then once you're realizing that that's not the long-term business and you need to pivot into something new?
Yeah. So one thing that you should reflect on is not only your purpose, but also your strengths and natural inclinations. And in my case, I mean, having spent 10 years in the corporate world, having learned a hell of a lot about startup methodologies like the lean startup, like design thinking and everything else, I realized that, well, large organizations are seeking out this type of knowledge because they're very much used to delivering on an existing repeatable business model, not necessarily discovering new repeatable business models. But I've learned all these tools. I know how these organizations work. I know how to sell to them. I know what their procurement processes look like. So I was in a naturally sort of advantageous position. And it just so happened that at the time I had befriended a founder at a co-working space here in Melbourne, General Assembly, one of his biggest tenants. He had a couple classrooms on the premises, and they basically handed in their notice to terminate the contract. They were going to go find their own place. So he essentially had his biggest flagship tenant gone, but he had 2 classrooms. And I said, well, hey, I'm thinking about starting this school to essentially help large companies adopt the lean startup and techniques to help them get better at rapid experimentation. So they stop wasting their money on big, hairy, audacious projects that cost a lot of time and money, but deliver no benefits realization. And he said, sure, well, let's run an experiment. And all we did was set up a Eventbrite page, something like, it was called Lean Startup for Corporates. I spent about $100 on Facebook ads and messaged a bunch of innovation managers on LinkedIn. We got something like 50 RSVPs. And I remember that night vividly, 50 chairs, the wine, the plastic cups, the food, everything on point. And when all was said and done, we had about 3 people turn up. And at that point, you reflect, right? It's an opportunity to say, well, hey, we got 50 emails. That's a starting point. What can we change next time? Perhaps we hold it on another night. Perhaps we send an email out before the event to say, hey, here's a reminder, make sure you turn up. But also 3 people or 300 people, you've got to bring it, because it could be one person in that audience who likes what you're doing, who has the authority to sign on the dotted line. And so you just bring it. And we kept iterating. And that's the key. Keep iterating, keep tweaking the copy, the marketing channel, whatever strategies you're employing to try and get people to turn up to those classes. And slowly but surely, more and more people turned up. But one thing I will stress there was, because there was just 3 people in the audience, one thing I read when I was 16 was it was the biography of Aerosmith. And in that biography, Steven Tyler tells a story of how in the 70s, when they were playing lowly bars in front of 15 people, he would still act like a rock star. So you've just got to keep bringing it, because not only is it going to help you get better at your craft, but you never know who's in the audience. So that was a key lesson for me, regardless of how many people turn up.
I love that. And so you, as we mentioned in the intro, you've gone on to do multiple different businesses since those early days. What's your primary focus today? And then I'd love to start to get into your new book a little bit as well. But let's start with the primary focus.
Sure. So I always tell entrepreneurs that when you're starting out, you might have A, B, C, D, E clients, or A, B, C, D, E focuses. And that over time, you'll drop the E's and the D's and the C's and focus on your big 1 or 2. So for me right now, Collective Campus is very much the big A. That's our corporate innovation and startup accelerator. That's where we get most of our recurring revenue from. But the project that I'm really excited by is Lemonade Stand, our children's entrepreneurship program, which we founded a couple of years ago. It's been rolled out to about 1,000 kids across Australia and Singapore. But up until now, it's been a 2-day workshop. And during those 2 days, we basically guide kids through identifying a problem, because for so long now, kids have been asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? And well, that presupposes that there can only be one thing. And 2, that also suggests that that one thing will be around in 15, 20 years when the rate of change suggests that a lot of jobs are going to be automated. So we ask kids, what problem do you want to solve in the world? So we help them identify problems, solutions, build a simple business model, build prototypes, do some marketing, get some feedback, and then essentially pitch their ideas. Now, this has been one of our more popular programs. And just last year, we ended up partnering with a large school, a large private school here in Melbourne, to build the online version. And so that's currently being piloted by them. And we're looking to roll that out nationwide and potentially to other English-speaking countries later this year. And that's something that's really exciting for us because up until now, most of what we do, except for, say, the podcast maybe and the books, has not been really scalable. It's been service-based businesses reliant on human beings with the support of automation tools and outsourcing. But something like that, not only is it exciting from a scalability perspective, but it's exciting because of what it can help kids with, which is preparing them for the ambiguity that's coming their way, helping them become more adaptable, helping them get better at problem solving, and just building that resilience. Because entrepreneurship, you think you've got a great idea, you put it out there, it completely tanks, you learn what was wrong, you go back to the drawing board, you update it, and you go through this virtuous cycle. And, introducing kids to that at a young age, I think can go a really long way to best preparing them for an uncertain sort of future when it comes to the employment landscape.
Yeah, I think that's such a cool project. And kudos to you for starting that. I'm glad that it's gaining so much traction. Are there one or two projects with the 1,000 kids who have gone through it so far that have just really impressed you in terms of what they've come up with?
Yeah, it's funny because when they come through the program, they tend to focus on your disruptive ideas. For example, something like Netflix for video games. Hey, video games are so expensive. That's a problem we want to solve. And so, well, what if there was a Netflix for video games? What would that look like? How can we build that? So they'd start there, but then they bring it back to something that they can actually do. Kind of like me with Hotdesk, not having any experience with software or as a service development at the time, and then bringing it back to corporate innovation. So some of the success stories that have come out of Lemonade Stand, one would be an 11-year-old who basically set up it was an e-commerce platform where he would sell water sports equipment. And he emailed me 3 months after graduating from the program. And in that email, he said something like, "Hey, Steve, just wanted to reach out to let you know that my online business is up and running. If it wasn't for the Lemonade Stand program, I wouldn't have known that this was even something I could do. You opened my eyes up to so much opportunity. So I just wanted to say thank you. And if you decide that you want to buy a stand-up paddleboard, here's my website." So he tried to sell me on the way out, which was awesome. And
always be closing.
Always be closing, man. And I didn't buy a board, but we bought a paddle and we put it up on the wall in our office. So it's a nice reminder of the kind of why we do the kind of work that we do. And, bringing it back to what I was saying about being miserably comfortable and standing on that train station platform and wondering, what did I contribute today? When you receive emails like that, whether it's from startups I've worked with, whether it's from kids in the Lemonade Stand program, or even podcast guests, there is no questioning what value I contributed at the end of the day.
That's super cool. And so when did the inspiration for the new book, Employee to Entrepreneur, come about? And what was your goal with publishing that?
Yeah. So the inspiration was the fact that with a lot of the large companies we work with, so many of their employees will be asking me, "Hey, Steve, I've got this idea. I just don't know how to start. I don't want to make any mistakes. I don't know if it's the right time." There's that. I also observe so many startups. 95% of startups fail, and it's usually because of the same reasons, jumping to conclusions or paralysis analysis or raising too much, or raising too much funding upfront and confusing that with market validation. So they go off and hire a big team and spend all this money on features that nobody asked for. But at its core, there are books out there on entrepreneurship. There is the Lean Startup. There are numerous books, but this book is really targeted at people who are employed by a large organization. Maybe they have been for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. And so they've become institutionalized to certain ways of thinking. And the fundamental difference between a large organization and a small one is that a large organization has a business model. It's making money. It can just execute on that. It's essentially playing defense. Whereas with a startup or an entrepreneurial pursuit, when you're first getting going, you haven't got a business model. You haven't got money coming in. There's a lot of uncertainty. And so you need to play offense. So in one case, you need to move slowly, and in the next case, you need to move quickly. So the skills you pick up in the corporate world around research, analysis, and planning, they're valuable, but if taken too far, they can be detrimental. And that's where you have people jumping to conclusions or spending too much time on elaborate business plans based on nothing but their own assumptions and not customer feedback, can be their undoing. And you also have people operating in stealth mode and being overly concerned with things like intellectual property when they really haven't got anything to protect yet. And your best defense against someone else copying your idea is to move faster than them and to execute better than them. And so it's really about helping a lot of entrepreneurs or helping a lot of employees who want to make that transition, make it by avoiding a lot of common pitfalls and also giving them access to a lot of tools, techniques, and strategies that are going to increase their likelihood of success. But one thing I will say is that even though the title of the book is Employee to Entrepreneur, I have an entire chapter on alternatives to entrepreneurship, because people may hate their job, they may hate their boss, they may hate the industry they're in, but that doesn't mean that you want to quit your $80,000 a year, 40-hour-a-week job for a $40,000 a year, 80-hour-a-week job, which is entrepreneurship when you first start out. And so I put forward a number of alternatives that people might explore, whether it's just getting a job somewhere else, making a lateral move in that company, picking up a hobby on the side. Entrepreneurship may not be the first thing you want to explore if you say, quote unquote, hate your job.
Yeah, I think that's a good call out. And I think that's your message and your book is going to really hit home with some of the folks listening to this show. Is there any specific tactical advice? Obviously, I encourage everybody to go grab a copy of the book and really dive into the weeds. But is there anything tactical that you would share that may be from the book in terms of some of those early steps that people can start taking when they're thinking about making the leap?
Yeah, I mean, at its core, it is really about identifying what your assumptions are pertaining to the problem, the solution, and the customer segment. And then based on that, identifying what are the highest impact assumptions that you are the least certain about. So for example, I might have identified 3 customer segments such as blue collar worker, white collar worker, and hospitality worker. And for my product, I am confident that blue collar workers will use it, but less so for white collar workers or hospitality workers. And I might rate the impact of them not using it a 10 and the certainty of them using it maybe a 3. And so then I would take impact divided by certainty and the number would be 3.33 or something like that. So the higher that number in terms of impact of an assumption being false and your certainty that that assumption is true or false, that's the kind of thing you want to test. So a lot of startups listening to this, a lot of entrepreneurs listening to this may think, yeah, we know about testing assumptions, but it's about testing those high impact, low certainty assumptions. That's key, because you can test anything and everything. But I see so many entrepreneurs fall into the trap of saying, yeah, no, we've been practicing the lean startup and we've been testing whether or not people will use our product as an app. And more often than not, we know that people will use apps. It just needs to be a compelling one where the problem and solution resonates with a particular customer segment. So really identify your customer segment, your problem, your solution, pull out the key assumptions, prioritize them by impact and certainty, and then find a quick, low fidelity way to test those assumptions. And I call that find the low fidelity prototype with the highest ROI, which is learning on investment. So something like, for example, a landing page. The learning you might get from directing people to a landing page and seeing whether or not they sign up, you might rate that an 8 out of 10. But in terms of the investment, setting that up, 2 out of 10. Really quick, really easy. So again, being somewhat methodical with it, divide 8 by 2, 4. And then just compare that to your other prototype options and do the one that's going to give you the highest ROI. So that's, in a nutshell, some methods that people might want to explore, some actionable takeaways. But we have a whole chapter on how you go about that, complete with graphics and charts and things of that sort to make that easier. So when I'm actually articulating it, it's not as clear as it is on the page.
Yeah, no, I encourage people to check that out. Sounds like a very methodical way to think about that and to actually be able to put some tangible analysis into the way that you're approaching your business.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Just to double down, the reason people want to do that is because as an entrepreneur, time is your most precious commodity. So if you're testing the wrong assumption, if you're building a prototype that's going to take you 5 times as long as it needs to test your assumption, then you're basically bleeding time and potentially bleeding money as well. And success in entrepreneurship is about how quickly you can learn. As Eric Ries says, the startups that learn the quickest win. So anything that's going to slow you down, especially in those early stages, can be your undoing. So whatever you can do to apply a methodical way to prioritize how you spend your time will go a very long way.
So, Steve, you've experienced now the ups and downs of entrepreneurship, and you've come from a successful career in a more corporate role, and coming from that world, I'm just curious, what have you learned that when you were in your late 20s and you were just starting to get off the ground with Hot Desk, what do you wish you knew back then? Or if you could go back in time and give yourself one piece of advice, what would it be?
One piece of advice would be to just check your ego at the door, especially when it comes to sharing your idea with people and they're criticizing the idea. I think having come out of the corporate world where we all strive to have the right answer all the time and to project this image of superiority and whatnot, and even coming up through school, you get the right answer, big green tick. Maybe even in elementary school, it's a little sticker that smells like a banana when you scratch it. But if you don't get the right answer, it's a big red cross, right? So we are essentially conditioned to shy away from criticism and to avoid having our ego hurt. But man, what's going to move you further, faster is feedback. Even if that feedback doesn't feel good in the moment, listen to it, see if there's any merit to that feedback, and then go back to your assumptions, your business model, and update things if you need to. Test these new assumptions that the feedback has pushed you towards. Because we can all operate in silos, in our little echo chambers, and surround ourselves with people who just say, yes, 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 you're awesome. But that's not necessarily going to move us closer to our goals. So holding, in the words of Mark Andreessen, strong opinions, loosely held. I think that's been a big thing for me, because for so long I would, especially during my early entrepreneurial days, just think that what I was working on was awesome. And, I had that false sense of validation from raising a bag of money very, very early on in my journey. And for a lot of entrepreneurs who raise money before they create any revenue, it can give them a false sense of security, and they will double down on the wrong things. So just holding strong opinions loosely, and that ties into the whole experimentation piece, because if you're doing that, you're less likely to jump to conclusions and double down on the wrong areas.
That's some super strong advice. And checking the ego at the door, I think, is so important. And it's something we all struggle with. I mean, it's something that maybe you get better at recognizing over time, but never completely goes away. So something that can always be improved upon and worked on. Steve, people are going to be loving what you're talking about here. I mean, your message, your new book aligns so well with this podcast and with the audience. Where can people find more about you? Where can they check out the book if they want to continue to hear more of what you put out there?
Sure. So people can visit steveglaveski.com, and that's where they'll find links to my podcast, Future Squared, as well as all my other ventures. If they want to learn more about the book, just hit up Amazon or visit employee2entrepreneur.io. At that website, you can also find a free bonus bundle, which I believe includes some of the stuff I was talking about earlier with respect to mapping out your assumptions, prioritizing your assumptions, determining what prototypes you can build. So some really good stuff in there that I'm giving away for free that people can check out at the website.
That's awesome. Well, we very much appreciate you stopping by today, sharing some of your wisdom, some of the things you've learned from both your successes and challenges that you faced over your entrepreneurial career, and wishing you the most success in the coming years. And we're excited to see everything that you do. So thank you, Steve.
No, thank you so much, Brad, for having me.